Hi guys, welcome back. We're just gonna go over a few more micro and macroeconomic questions today. My name is Jeffrey. I just chose these questions from a pre-existing list. Haven't gone over the answers myself yet, so I'll be doing these just along with you guys. Once we get to the right answer for these questions, we're going to take a look at some of the answers that a previous tutor has written and make sure that those are all squared away. That being said, let's just jump right in. This first question says, why do oligopolies exist? Explain the characteristics of an oligopolist whose product you own or regularly purchase. What distinguishes oligopoly from monopolistic competition? So this is a pretty open-ended question. First, before we even touch on these questions that they're asking, let's answer the question, what is an oligopoly, right? So an oligopoly is a market structure that's kind of similar to a monopoly, but instead of having one single supplier that dominates the entire market and has 100% market share, you have several different companies or several different firms which split the overall market. It's still very, very concentrated in terms of market share. It's just not just one single firm. The next question that they're asking us is why do oligopolies exist? And a lot of the times the reason that we see oligopolies exist is either high entry costs or something like economies of scale, right? Where there's just a really, really high initial cost to enter this market that prevents a lot of smaller firms from participating and taking away market share from larger firms. And so the existing firms have this advantage as being established in this industry where they already have invested that upfront, made that an upfront investment and start to experience economies of scale where as they grow larger and larger, their average cost is actually decreasing. And that's why oligopolies exist. The next question asks us to explain the characteristics of oligopolists whose products you own or regularly purchase. So I don't know about owning or regular purchase, but a common example of oligopolies include the automobile industry. So if you think about the number of car brands out there, you can probably name the big ones right off the top of your head. There's Honda, Toyota, then you have GM, Ford, Mercedes, Audi. You might feel like, well, that seems like more than a few companies, but the fact that you can name most of the car brands that dominate the market without really having to think very hard means that it's most likely an oligopolist industry. You can compare that to a different product which might not be an oligopoly, might be close to perfect competition, like the brand of corn that you buy or what farmer you buy your corn from. That you have no idea who the manufacturers are because there's so many and the products are so indistinguishable that you're really not trying to, you don't really have an idea who those producers are. So the last question they're asking is what distinguishes oligopoly from monopolistic competition? So let's review what monopolistic competition is. We already talked about monopolies, which is where one producer dominates the entire market. Oligopolies where a few producers dominate the entire market. Monopolistic competition is when there's a lot of producers in the market, and it's distinguished from perfect competition in that in monopolistic competition, the firms sell slightly distinguished products. So there's a possibility to distinguish yourself from other firms in the market. And so that's the main difference. You see the difference between oligopoly and monopolistic competition when we're talking about the oligopolies having high entry costs to their industry and experiencing drastic economies of scale, whereas monopolistic competition simply refers to the idea that producers have the ability to slightly differentiate their products from one another. Okay, so hopefully that covers all the bases for this question. We can take a look at what the previous tutor has said. So the previous tutor said that oligopolies exist for several reasons, the most common probably being economies of scale. If these are substantial as they are in the automobile industry, for example, only very large firms can produce at minimum average costs. This makes it virtually impossible for new firms to enter the industry. A small firm could not produce at minimum cost and would soon be competed out of the business. Yet to start at the required very large scale would take far more money than an unestablished firm is likely to be able to raise before proving it will be profitable. I just realized I didn't really explain why automobiles end up being oligopolies, only that they are. The reason that automobiles are a classic example of oligopolies is, again, there's a few companies that dominate the market, and the reason there's only a few companies is because if you want to get into the automobile manufacturing business, you need to spend a lot of capital on designing your own car. You have to spend a lot of capital on building a car factory, which is the most expensive part of operating an automobile manufacturing firm. So you have to invest millions of dollars into building these factories and then pump out enough output for that to be worth it. And so that upfront cost before you can experience any economies of scale is why the automobile industry is a good example of an oligopoly. Okay, the previous year also says other barriers to entry include ownership of patents by the oligopolists and possibly massive advertising that gives would-be newcomers no chance to establish a presence in the public's mind. Finally, there is the urge to merge. Mergers have the clear advantage of reducing competition, of giving the emerging oligopolists more monopoly power. Also, they may result in more economies of scale and thereby increase that barrier to new entry. Oligopolies with which we deal with include manufacturers of automobiles, ovens, refrigerators, personal computers, gasoline, and courier systems. Services. An oligopoly is distinguished from monopolistic competition by being composed of few firms, not many, by being mutually interdependent with regard to price, by having differentiated or homogeneous products, and by having significant obstacles to entry, both engage in much non-price competition. So I think one thing that the previous year touches on that I think is also important to highlight is this idea of mutual interdependence with regard to price. Oligopolies are the primary market type you're going to deal with when you start learning about game theory, which is the idea that which is the study of like games in which one firm or one person's decisions are going to be dependent on the decision that another firm makes. So in an oligopoly, because there's only a few firms that make up the industry, pricing decisions or advertising decisions by one firm are going to be directly relevant to the pricing and advertising and production decisions of the other firms. And this is unlike in other markets where there's a lot of competition, because in a perfectly competitive market, one firm deciding to advertise more or to do it to some different pricing scheme has no impact on another firm's decision to do something similar. And that's a big distinguishing point. And if you guys get into game theory, like that's going to be something that you guys will definitely learn about. Good. I don't think there's anything wrong with this answer though. So great answer. We can move on. Now let's take a look at another question. Okay, looks like we got a couple here. So question 36 says, a firm encountering economies of scale over some range of output will have a rising long-run average cost curve, B, falling long-run average cost curve, C, constant long-run average cost curve, D, rising then falling then rising long-run average cost curve. So again, we mentioned this a little bit in the previous question, but economies of scale refers to a circumstance for certain industries and certain producers where, for a certain range of output, increasing the overall level of output actually starts to decrease your long-run average costs. The reason we see this is often in industries where fixed cost is very high and variable cost is very low. Again, like an automobile industry where you have high fixed cost to build a factory, but low fixed cost to build each car. And so in those circumstances, by increasing the output, you're actually decreasing your overall average cost because you're dividing the fixed costs that you incurred in the initial start of the company among more and more units of production. So going back to this question, if you're encountering economies of scale, that means you are in that range in which your cost curve is falling. And so we would say that answer choice B is the best answer here. A firm encountering economies of scale over some range of output will have a falling long-run average cost curve. And so that would be our best answer here. Taking a look at the previous year's answer, they also put B, and so we're all set there. Okay, question 37 says, when a firm doubles its input and finds that its output has more than doubled, this is known as A, economies of scale, B, constant returns to scale, C, diseconomies of scale, or D, a violation of the law of diminishing returns. So let's break this down between by the answer choices. A says economies of scale, and so we know that for economies of scale, uh, when you have production going up for variable input, and then you have a decrease in overall average costs, then that would be what we would refer to as economies of scale. That doesn't seem to match up with what we're talking about here, because we don't even talk about costs at all for this firm, right? So it doesn't seem to be the fact that the case that A would be the right answer here. B says constant returns to scale, and again, constant returns to scale refers to a situation where increasing one's output has no impact on increasing or decreasing average costs. And so again, with this question, we're not dealing with cost, it seems like, and so that doesn't seem to be the case for this question in particular. C says diseconomies of scale, and diseconomies of scale refers to a situation in which the increasing output levels actually increases your average cost, and so it's bad. And so again, we're not talking about cost in this question, so it doesn't seem to be the case that diseconomies of scale is the right answer here. And we're left with D, a violation of the law of diminishing returns. And what the law of diminishing returns says is that when you start to increase your inputs, for example, labor, that each additional increase in input should decrease the overall production or output marginally for each marginal increase in inputs. So when we say in this question that you've doubled inputs and then you found that output has more than doubled, that seems to be a clear violation of the law of diminishing returns, because the output increase has outpaced the growth in inputs, and that's not what you would expect to see when you're looking at the law of diminishing returns. So it seems to be that for this question, D would be the right answer. When a firm doubles its inputs and finds that its output has more than doubled, this is known as a violation of the law of diminishing returns. So the previous tutor put economies of scale, and that's going to be a hard one for me to agree with, just because, again, economies of scale refer to a situation in which increasing output decreases costs, and we have no mention of whether or not costs have increased or decreased in this question. And so, moreover, D seems to be clearly correct when we look at the fact that the law of diminishing returns says that something that is laid out in this problem would not be possible. So we're going to have to correct that, and I'll write a quick addendum here. 37, D is the right answer. The question mentions nothing about average total costs, so we would not be able to make a determination about economies of scale. Meanwhile, a doubling of input leading to a more than doubling of output clearly violates the law of diminishing returns, as we would expect a less than doubling of output. Okay, let's go to 38. 38 says, the larger the diameter of a natural gas pipeline, the lower is the average total cost of transmitting 1,000 cubic feet of gas 1,000 miles. And this is an example of A, economies of scale, B, normative economies, C, diminishing marginal returns, and D, an increasing marginal product of labor. And so here, again, we see that increasing increase in diameter of this natural gas pipeline, which we can maybe assume is going to be symbolic of increasing output level, is going to lower the average total cost of transmitting the cubic feet of gas. That, again, seems to be an example of economies of scale, where as you increase output levels, the total cost or average total cost of those output levels are actually going to go down. And so this is a situation where economies of scale will be an appropriate answer. And so we see that the previous tutor also agrees with us here, so that's good. 39 says, if all resources used in the production of a product are increased by 20% and output increases by 20%, then there must be A, economies of scale, B, constant returns to scale, C, diseconomies of scale, or D, increasing average total costs. And so in this current circumstance, when we look at the when we look at the ratio of resources used to the output increase and they're both matched, that seems to be a circumstance where we would be looking at constant returns to scale, where having that increase in resource usage is actually going to be matched by the output increase that results from that resource usage increase. And so constant returns to scale would be the best answer here for this question. Let's take a look at the previous tutor's answer. And the previous tutor said diseconomies of scale. And so again, for diseconomies of scale, we would assume that increasing output would actually lead to an increase in overall costs. And that's not what we're seeing here. So we can write a correction here for that and say that the correct answer here is B is the correct answer. The match in percentage increases fits the definition of constant returns to scale. And finally, question 40 says, economies and diseconomies of scale explain why the A, short-run average fixed cost curve declines so long as output increases. B, marginal cost curve must intersect the minimum point of the firm's average total cost curve. C, long-run average total cost curve is typically U-shaped. Or D, short-run average variable cost curve is U-shaped. And so usually what we'll see is you'll experience economies of scale in the short run. In the medium term, you'll experience constant returns to scale. In the long term, you experience diseconomies of scale. And if you put that all together, you're going to get a graph that looks something like this. Oh, sorry, let me draw this out. So we have, costs on the y-axis, quantity on the x-axis. So in the beginning of production, you have decreasing. So you have economies of scale, and then you have constant economies of scale, and then you have diseconomies of scale. And so this is that U shape that C is talking about, and that's what that long-run average total cost curve looks like. And we can confirm this by looking at a graph that we can look up, and you'll see here that we draw that long average total cost curve as that U shape here. And so the correct answer would be C. Economies and diseconomies of scale explain why the long run average total cost curve is typically U-shaped. And so that's going to be our best answer here. And so we're going to mark this solution as incorrect, and we can move on. Give me one moment. I'm going to try and fix my graphics over here, so I'll be right back. Okay, let's take a look at these questions then. This question says that 1, In economics, the demand for a good refers to the amount of the good that people A will buy at alternative income levels, B need to achieve a minimum standard of living, C will buy at various prices, or D would like to have the good for free. And so when we look at demand for a good, we're looking at the demand curve and the law of demand, and it's basically telling us at every single price level, how much do people want to buy overall? And so that's going to be best matched by answer choice C, right? In economics, the demand for a good refers to the amount of the good that people will buy at various prices. None of the other answer choices seem to really depict the relationship we see presented to us on the demand curve. And so we're going to go with C. And so we can check the correct answer, and the previous tutor also said C, which is great. 2 says, the term ceteris paribus means that A, what is for the individual is not necessarily true for the whole. B, all variables except those specified are constant. C, everything is variable. D, no one knows which variable will change and which will remain constant. So this seems to be a really definition-based question. Ceteris paribus, I believe it's Latin. I'm not exactly sure, don't quote me on that. But it is a term that you'll often hear in economics, and it is basically used to say holding all else equal, right? And so the reason we make this assumption that we want to hold everything else equal is so that we can try and isolate what are the causal factors for different things that are shifting in our economic models. And so holding all else equal is typically what we think of, and that seems to be best matched by answer choice B. The term ceteris paribus means that all variables except those specified are constant. And that seems to best depict that definition. And so let's take a look at the correct answer choice, or the answer choice the previous tutor picked. And they picked B as well, which is great. Okay, let's move on to question number 3. Question number 3 says, when economists talk about supply, they are referring to a relationship between price received for each unit sold and the A, quantity supplied, B, demand schedule, C, demand curve, or D, market price. And so again, looking at the supply curve, we see on the x-axis we have quantity supplied, and on the y-axis we have units sold. Sorry, price level in the economy. And so the supply curve is depicting the relationship between those two things. So the question gives us price already, and then the other thing that is related to that price on the supply curve is going to be quantity supplied. And so A is going to be the right answer for this question. Let's take a look at what the previous tutor said. Previous tutor said A as well, which is great. We can move on to question 4. Question 4 says, but nearly all supply curves share a basic similarity. They slope blank. A, up from left to right. B, down from left to right. C, up from right to left. D, down from right to left. And so what we're looking at here is the supply curve. We have price and quantity, and we know that supply curves typically look like this. It's an upward sloping line, right? So which one of these best describes this shape? A says up from left to right, and that seems to be true. And so, I mean, the thing that confuses me is, like, you could also say it's down from right to left, right? It starts high on the right side and goes down from the left side. I'm going to still go with A, up from left to right, only because we typically read the graph that way, and that's the best way to understand it. And we typically think upward sloping or positive slope when we think supply curve. We don't think downward sloping from the left. From the right, right? So A is going to be the best answer here for me. And so let's take a look at what the previous tutor said. So the previous tutor said B, and they say quantity is negatively related to price. So I think they might have confused this with the demand curve. For suppliers, quantity is positively related to price. The more money that suppliers can sell their goods for on the market, the more they're going to be willing to supply, right? Not less. And so it's going to be A for question 4, if that is the correct answer. So I'll leave it for A. For suppliers, quantity supplied is positively correlated with price. Okay, so let's take a look at the next question. Question 5. The nature of demand indicates that as the price of a good increases, A, suppliers wish to sell less of it. B, buyers decide to purchase less of it. C, more of it is desired. Or D, more of it is produced. And so this is again looking at the demand curve, looking at what is going on with the law of demand. And so we can draw this out one more time. All right, this is that graph. We have our price, we have quantity, we have our downward sloping demand curve. And so there's a negative relationship between price and quantity supplied. And so as the price of a good is going up, so you're going from, let's say, this point to this point, you see the price is going up. And what happens to the quantity that people are buying? And the quantity purchased is going to go down. You used to have purchasing of this quantity. Now it falls to this quantity. And so as price goes up, quantity demand goes down. That is, in fact, what the law of demand tells us. And so the correct answer here is probably going to be answer choice B, right? The nature of demand indicates that as the price of a good increases, buyers desire to purchase less of it. And so that none of the other answer choices are going to come close to what we're looking for. And so B is going to be the right answer for this question. And we can take a look at the previous tutor's answer. So for 5, they also chose B due to an inverse relationship between price and demand. Well, that's great. We can move on to question 6. Any given demand or supply curve is based on the setter's previous assumption that A, everything is variable, B, all else is held equal, C, no one knows which variable will change and which will remain constant, or D, what is true for the individual is not necessarily true for the whole. And so, again, this is very similar to what we were looking at the previous question for what does ceteris paribus mean. And again, we said that ceteris paribus refers to holding all else equal. And that is going to be, this is a very simple definition question. That's something you're going to have to remember. And B is going to be the correct answer here for this question. Any given demand or supply curve is based on the ceteris paribus assumption that all else is held equal. Pretty straightforward. And so you can take a look at question 6. And again, the previous tutor also says B, all else is held equal, like for price and demand, relationship, income, tastes, preferences are held constant. Yeah, so that's good. Let's move on to question 7. Economists refer to a relationship that a higher price leads to a lower quantity demanded as the A, price model, B, law of demand, C, market equilibrium, or D, income gap. And again, what we're looking at here is going to be something fundamental to economics. The inverse relationship between quantity demanded and price is referred to as the law of demand, which tells us that relationship. And so B is going to be the best answer here. The economists refer to a relationship that a higher price leads to lower quantity demanded as the law of demand. And we can check the previous tutor's answer, and they're also saying the law of demand specifies a negative relationship between quantity and price. Great, let's move on to question 8. A perfectly elastic supply curve is which one of the following? A, vertical, B, downward sloping to the left, C, horizontal, D, upward sloping to the right. And so what we're looking at here is whether or not we're familiar with what the graphical representation of perfect elasticity is. Let's quickly review what perfect elasticity refers to. Perfect elasticity refers to when any change in price leads to 100% loss in quantity demanded. And so there's only one price level that you can take, and you're basically a price taker. What that looks like on a graph is something like this. We have price, we have quantity, and our supply curve is going to be a horizontal line. This is the only price that you're allowed to charge. You cannot increase price, you cannot decrease price. Any increase or decrease in price would mean you would have to exit the market. And so that's going to be a horizontal supply curve, and that is best matched by answer choice C. A perfectly elastic supply curve is horizontal. Let's take a look at the previous tutor's answer. Previous tutor said C, horizontal as for given change in quantity, change in price, quantity changes by an infinite amount. Great. Question 9 says a 10% increase in the price of soda leads to a 20% increase in the quantity of iced tea demanded. It appears that A, elasticity of demand for iced tea is 2 and is elastic. B says cross-price elasticity of demand for iced tea is -2. C says cross-price elasticity of demand for soda is -0.5. And D says elasticity of demand for soda is 0.5 and it's inelastic. So right off the bat, we're looking at two different products. We're looking at a price increase for soda and an increase in quantity for iced tea. That tells us we're going to be dealing with cross-price elasticity, where we're dealing with complementary or substitute goods. We can already eliminate A and D because we're not given information about price change that is in a quantity change for a single product, right? And so A and D would not work because we don't have the information to answer those two. So it's either going to be B or C. Now looking at cross-price elasticity, we can say that the equation is given by percentage change in quantity demanded of good A, and that's our primary good, divided by percentage change in price of good B, right? And so in this case, good A is going to be iced tea, or actually we can try both, right? So cross-price elasticity of demand for iced tea, which means iced tea would be A, would say that a 20% increase in quantity demanded happened, right? 20 divided by a 10% increase in the price of soda, and so that's going to be a 10% on the bottom. So we get that the relationship would be equal to -2, right? So again, elasticities are negative, and so that seems to be the case for our circumstance. 10% increase in the price of sodas leads to a 20% increase in the quantity of iced tea demanded. Appears that, so I actually don't think it would be negative, right? It would be positive. So it looks like that's not going to match. So we can try to cross-price elasticity demands for soda, but the difference is because for soda we don't know what the quantity changes, we actually can't calculate the cross-price elasticity of demand for soda. So it looks like the correct answer here has to be B. Cross-price elasticity demand for iced tea is -2, and that's the only issue I take with this is that I don't believe it would be -2 because in this circumstance we're looking at a situation in which the price is going up and the quantity demanded is going up for a different good, which means that this is a substitute good, not a complementary good, right? And we can look at the interpretation of cross-price elasticity, interpreting cross-price elasticity to also understand that good. Right, so here we have a circumstance where the cross-elasticity of demand for substitute goods is always positive because demand for one good increases when the price of the substitute increases, whereas the cross-price elasticity of demand for complementary goods is negative. And so for these goods, we clearly have substitutes, and that's why we have a positive cross-price elasticity. So it doesn't appear that any of these are the right answer, but we can clarify that in the answer choice description. So again, let's take a look at the previous year's answer. They chose B. Cross-price elasticity is equal to the change in quantity divided by change in price. 20 divided by 10 equals 2. Sign is positive. So yeah, it looks like the question itself was phrased incorrectly, but the tutor is also on the same page that the sign must be positive for this question. Let's take a look at question 10. Blank is the change in what is on the horizontal axis, quantity, divided by the change with what is on the vertical axis, or price. And so we just went over this general concept that percentage change in quantity divided by percentage change in price is the general format for the elasticity equation. And so elasticity is going to be the correct answer here. Elasticity is the change in change in quantity divided by change in price. Remember, it's percentage change. And so A is going to be the correct answer here. Let's take a look at the previous tutor's answer. They also chose A, elasticity, and so we can move on to question 11. Question 11 says, a severe freeze has once again damaged the Florida orange crop. The impact on the market for orange juice will be a leftward shift of A, the supply curve, and the rightward shift of the demand curve, resulting in a higher equilibrium price. B, both the supply and demand curves. C, the supply curves, or D, the demand curve, as consumers try to economize because of shortage. So it looks like there's a combination of answers that some suggest there's going to be a supply curve shift, some suggest there's going to be a demand curve shift, and some suggest a combination of both. When we have a severe freeze that damages the crop yield for a certain good, that's something that purely affects the producer side, the supplier side, right? Whether or not there is availability of oranges does not really impact the demand by consumers for oranges. It merely impacts the availability. And so we're looking for an answer choice that talks only about a change to a supply curve. And so the leftward shift is going to be seen on the supply curve, and that's going to be given by answer choice C. And we can take a look at the previous year's answers to make sure we're on the same page here. And the previous year also says C, as due to the damage of orange crop, supply curve will shift leftward. 13 says, a drought decreases the supply of agricultural products, which means that at any given price, a lower quantity will be supplied. Conversely, especially good weather would shift the A, demand curve to the right, B, supply curve to the left, C, supply curve to the right, or D, demand curve to the left. And again, we're talking about determinants of supply versus determinants of demand. If we're saying that weather has a direct impact on agricultural products and poor weather leads to a decrease in quantity, then it would stand to reason that good weather would lead to an increase in quantity at every given price. An increase in quantity supplied at every given price is known as a supply curve shift to the right. Again, we're not really expecting any changes to demand because this is simply on the production side, not on the consumption side. And so C is going to be the right answer here. Especially good weather would shift the supply curve to the right. And we can take a look at the previous year's answer. And they also say C, supply curve to the right, as at a given price, more will be supplied. So we are done with this list of questions. We're going to mark this solution as incorrect just because for 4, we disagreed with the previous year's answer. But other than that, all the other questions are right. Let's take a look at the next question. Which is the best example of a country that is dependent on other countries? A country that has little fertile soil. 2, a country that has no imports. 3, a country with grain surpluses. Or D, a country with a diverse economy. So let's break this down. If you're a country that is dependent on other countries, it usually means that you're incapable of producing all the products that you need without trading with other countries. And so specifically importing from other countries. A says a country that has little fertile soil. This is a good example. A country that has little fertile soil would have to depend on other countries in order to import all of those agricultural products that they can't grow by themselves. If this country with no fertile soil was unable to trade, then they would have very, very low production of these essential goods. And that's why they're dependent on other countries to get those goods. So it looks like 1 is going to be a good candidate for our right answer choice here. 2 says a country that has no imports. And again, this is hard to believe because if you have no imports, then you aren't really dependent on other countries. You don't need other countries to trade with you or to sell you their goods. And so this would not be what we're looking for in this question. 3 says a country with grain surpluses. And if you're a surplus, you're mostly an exporter. And so it's not necessarily the case that you're dependent on other countries. It's more likely that other countries are dependent on your surplus exports. So again, this doesn't really match what we're looking for here. And finally, D, 4, a country with a diverse economy. If your country has a diverse economy, then it's likely that you're able to produce a lot of different goods in your own domestic economy without engaging in trade. And so that's not going to be a country that we would expect to see very dependent on other countries because they have that robust ability to produce by themselves. And so what is going to be the best answer choice here? The best example of a country that is dependent on other countries is a country with little fertile soil. So let's take a look at the previous year's answer. And they also said 1, a country that has little fertile soil. And they said a country that has little fertile soil will have a low agricultural yield. Food is the most basic of all necessities upon which human civilization thrives. A nation hence cannot survive and grow if it lacks food to feed its population. Therefore, such a country will indulge in international trade to import food. This country will be dependent on other countries for food due to its comparative disadvantage. In exchange for imports, it will export a good or service in the production of which it has a comparative advantage. So yeah, definitely agree with that statement, and nothing really much to add there. And we can move on to the next question. Okay. So the next question says, assume that a hypothetical economy with a marginal propensity to consume of 0.9 is experiencing a severe recession. By how much would government spending have to rise to shift the aggregate demand curve rightward by $50 billion? So what we're really being tested on here is the multiplier effect for government spending. And so we're giving the multiplier effect by the equation 1 divided by 1 minus MPC, or 1 divided by MPS, marginal propensity to save. So we have 1 divided by 1 minus MPC equals 1 divided by MPS is equal to 1 divided by 1 minus 0.9, and that gives us 10. Right? That's the multiplier. And what that multiplier tells us is that for every dollar that government spends, the aggregate demand curve overall in the economy is going to shift rightward by $10. And so if our purpose, or if our goal is to shift the aggregate demand curve rightward by $50 billion through government spending, then we know that we would only have to spend $5 billion to get 10 times that, or $50 billion of increase in aggregate demand. So the correct answer for the first portion of this question is going to be $5 billion. Okay? Hopefully that makes sense by how we got to that answer. The next question says, how large of a tax cut would be needed to achieve the same increase in aggregate demand? And so this question is going to be given by the tax multiplier. And the tax multiplier is given by a slightly different equation. It's MPC divided by 1 minus MPC. So 0.9 divided by 0.1, or 9. Right? And so in this case, if we wanted to achieve the same increase in aggregate demand, we know that for every dollar that we decrease taxes, there's going to be a $9 increase in aggregate demand. So for a $50 billion increase in aggregate demand, we would need 50 divided by 9, is equal to $5.55 billion, and that's how much we need to decrease taxes by. And so the next question says, determine one possible combination of government spending increases and tax decreases that accomplish the same goal. And so we want to increase spending by X billion dollars and increase taxes by X billion dollars. And so one way to think about this is if we match spending to government to tax increases, we can take advantage of this decrease in the this difference in the multiplier in order to get the right answer, right? And so we know that for every dollar that we decrease in tax cuts, right, we would see a $9 decrease. Sorry, for every dollar we increase taxes, we would see a $9 decrease in aggregate demand. But if we use that dollar through some other form of government spending, then we would see a $10 increase in aggregate demand. So a total increase for that one exchange where we increase taxes by $1 and we increase spending by $1 is going to be a $1 increase in aggregate demand. So if we want $50 billion of aggregate demand to be increased by, then we would need to increase taxes and spending by $50 billion. We can see this with the following. So let's say we increase government spending by $50 billion. That means the total effect on aggregate demand is going to be 10 times that, because we have a multiplier of 10 times for government spending, for a total increase in the aggregate demand by $500 billion, right? And then, let's say we offset this $50 billion increase in spending with a $50 billion increase in taxes. And so, a $50 billion increase in taxes is going to give us a negative, and this multiplier is negative, we're going to give us a negative effect on the aggregate demand curve, right? Because by increasing taxes, you're taking money away from people and they can spend less. And so we can see that this increase in $50 billion taxes is going to lead to a $450 billion decrease in aggregate demand. So we've increased aggregate demand by 500 billion through our spending, and we've decreased aggregate demand by 450 billion through our tax increase. And that gives us a total increase of $50 billion in aggregate demand, and that was our end goal. And so we can see here with that offsetting way, we can use a combination of government spending increases and tax increases to accomplish the same goal as increasing the demand by $50 billion. So that's going to be the correct answer here. Let's take a look at the previous tutor's answer. So they say assume that a hypothetical economy of an MPC of 0.8. So it looks like this tutor answered a slightly different question because the question we have is a 0.9 and it looks like he answered 0.8 for some reason. So and they also want to shift to the aggregate demand curve right by 30 billion instead of 50 billion. So let's just check the process. So they got 25 billion, they got 6.25 billion, they have 26 billion here. Let's take a look at their answers, their work. So for their work, they calculated the multiplier for spending given by 1 divided by 1 minus MPC. That's the same thing we did, and they get a multiplier of 5. And they say that if you want to increase aggregate demand by $30 billion, then you need 30 divided by 5 multiplier, $6 billion increase in spending. And that's the same process we had. We said we wanted to increase demand by $50 billion. We want to divide it by our multiplier. 50 divided by 10 gives us $5 billion in spending. So we're on the same page there. 2, they calculate a tax multiplier like we did, and they say MPC divided by 1 minus MPC, same equation. 0.8 divided by 0.2 is equal to 4. So they got 4, we got 9. And they said the tax cut should be 30 divided by 4 is equal to 7.5 billion. For us, it would be 50 divided by 9, and that's 5.55 billion, right? That's all set for us. And finally, to get the combinations that would get us to 50 billion, they did 1 minus 1 minus, so they did multiplier they did the spending multiplier minus the tax multiplier gives them 1. Our spending multiplier minus the tax multiplier also gives us 1. The answer is an increase in spending in $30 billion and the increase in taxes of $30 billion. Spending will increase income by 30 times 5, so 150. For that's 50 times 10. And a tax increase will reduce income by 30 times 4. For us, that's 50 times 9. In sum, the income will increase by $30 billion. For us, it was $50 billion. So the work is the same. We're just going to write a kind of right answer here because the previous tutor answered the incorrect question. So looks like the previous tutor answered a question with slightly different numbers. For A, we would say that 1 divided by 1 minus MPC is equal to 1 divided by 0.1 is equal to 10, and that's the spending multiplier. For a $50 billion increase in AD, we would need a 50 divided by 10 equals $5 billion increase in government spending. Answer choice B says tax multiplier is equal to MPC divided by 1 minus MPC is equal to 0.9 divided by 0.1 is equal to 9. For a $50 billion increase in aggregate demand, we would need a 50 divided by 9 equals $5.55 billion decrease in taxes. And C says spending multiplier minus tax multiplier equal to 10 minus 9 equal to 1. For a $50 billion increase in AD, we would need a 50 divided by 1 equals $50 billion increase in spending funded by a $50 billion tax increase. And that's going to be the correct answer for this question with the correct numbers. And so we're going to mark the solution as incorrect just because they have the wrong numbers, and we'll submit this for an alternative solution. Okay, let's move on to the next question. The next question says, you're choosing between the two goods, X and Y, Your marginal utility from each one is shown above. Enter your answers as whole numbers. If A says if your income is $9 and the price of X and Y are $2 and $1 respectively, what quantities of each will you purchase to maximize utility? X equals blank units, Y equals blank units. So we're given this question here. We have units of X, we have marginal utility for each unit of X, you have units of Y and marginal utility of units of Y. Now remember, because there's a price difference between X and Y, we need to be able to compare this in an apples to apples way. And to do that, we need to do marginal utility per dollar. If the price of X is $2 and the price of Y is $1, we simply divide marginal utility by price. For Y, that means it stays the same, right? Because it's already $1. So 18 divided by 1 is going to be 18, 16 divided by 1 is going to be 16, and so on and so forth. For marginal utility of X, you're going to get a slightly different graph here. So for units of X, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. I'm not sure what's going on with this pen. 6. And so for marginal utility of X, we have 23 as a marginal utility divided by $2, right? Because that's our price. And we get 11.5, right? For 2, 16 divided by 2 is 8, 12 divided by 2 is 6, 8 divided by 2 is 4, 4 divided by 2 is 2, 2 divided by 2 is 1. And so this is our marginal utility per dollar. And this is how we're going to determine where we would spend given these prices and given our income level. And so in order to spend optimally, we want to buy the amount of units that we are allowed to buy within our budget that also make the marginal utility per dollar for good X equal to marginal utility per dollar of good Y. This is our utility maximizing condition. Marginal utility of good X per dollar is equal to marginal utility of good Y per dollar. That's what we want to make equal. So 11.5 is not equal to anything here. 8 is equal to something here. And let's take a look at what would happen if we were to consume 2 units of good X and 5 units of good Y. We would spend $2 per unit on the good X, so $4 total. And we would spend $1 each for 5 units of good Y, or $5 total. And that adds up to $9, which is perfect because that's how much money we have to spend. And so the correct answer here is that because we've reached our our utility maximizing condition of 2 units of good X and 5 units of good Y for a marginal utility per dollar of 8 each, right? The consumption bundle that we choose would be 2 units of good X and 5 units of good Y. Let's take a look at the previous year's answer. And so they said that total utility is maximized when the marginal utility per dollar of X is equal to marginal utility per dollar of Y. That's what we said as well. This is satisfied when X is equal to 2 and Y is equal to 5. The total cost is 2 times $2 and 5 times $1 equals 9. The budget is exhausted. And so there are other options that might work as well, but that would exceed the budget. And so the correct answer is 2 and 5. Next says, what total utility will you realize? So for total utility, what we're doing is we're adding up the marginal utility for every single unit of good that we purchased, right? And the sum of marginal utility gives us total utility. So if we purchase 2 goods at unit X, first unit of good of unit X that we purchased gave us 23 units of utility, right? Let's write this down, 23. And the second unit that we purchased gave us 16 units of utility, and that's 23 plus 16. And then for good Y, the first unit gave us 18 units of utility, the second gave us 16, third gave us 14, fourth gave us 10, and fifth gave us 8. And so these are the 7 units we purchased total, right? The first 2 are our units of X, 23 and 16 for our marginal utility, and the last 5 are our 5 units of Y. And added all together, we get our total utility. So what is the correct answer here? So 23 plus 16 is going to be 39 plus 18, 57. Why don't we just type this in? I'm not going to try to do this all in my head. 23 plus 16 plus 18 plus 16 plus 14 plus 10 plus 8 Make sure I typed it all in, 23, 16, 18, 16, 14, 10, and 8. And we get 105. 105 is going to be the total utility that we realize at this consumption bundle, right? And so let's take a look at what the previous tutor has said. Previous tutor said, total utility is equal to 2 times 16 plus 5 times 8, or 72. And so again, I think this is where the previous tutor got it wrong, right? Like, because we've produced, we don't have constant marginal utility, and because we've purchased multiple units, we have to add up the previous levels of utility in order to get the total utility. We can't simply just multiply the last unit of marginal utility and use that and say that's the utility we got from every single unit, because we know marginal utility is different for every unit. So for B, we can say the correct answer is 105. We have to add up all the marginal utilities from each good that was purchased in order to get the total utility. The first 2 units of X gave 23 and 16 utils, while the 5 units of Y gave 18 plus 16 plus 14 plus 10 plus 8 utils. In total, this consumption bundle of 2x and 5y gave us 105 utils. And that's going to be the correct answer here. Okay, let's take a look at question C. Assume that other things remain unchanged. The price of X falls to $1. What quantities of X and Y will you now purchase? So now we don't have to use this, a little graph that, a little table that I made, because the marginal utility of X is now exactly the same as the unit marginal utility of X, right? The marginal utility of X divided by the price of X is just marginal utility divided by 1, the same way it is for marginal utility of Y. So we're again looking for a circumstance in which we have the same, the same marginal utility for both goods, and we use up our full budget. So for 23 marginal utility of X, we see none of that match on the Y column, so we can say that's not going to be one of the elements of our final consumption bundle. For 16, we see that it does match up with the units for Y, and so we can say 2 units of X gives us 16, costs us $2, and 2 units of Y costs us $2 as well, and that would be $4 total. But remember, we have $9 to spend, and so this is a consumption bundle where we're indifferent between more units of good X and Y, but we have more money to spend. So let's see if we can match up to something else. For 3, we say that 12 is not equal to any of these goods, so that might not work. 8 matches up to the 5 units of Y for 8 as well, so we can say we spent $4 in units of X and $5 in units of Y, and that adds up to $9, and that seems to be the best bundle here. So the final answer for us should be 8 units of good X and 5 units of good Y, because we finally, again, found that utility maximizing point, or marginal utility per dollar, is the same for both goods. And so 4 units of good X and 5 units of good Y is our final answer. So C says X equals 4, Y equals 5. Another option would be X equals 2 and Y equals 2, but in such a case, total cost will be lower than the budget of 9. And so that's going to be matched with what we said, and the final question says, using the 2 prices and quantities for X, derive a demand schedule, a table showing prices and quantities demand for X. So we have price on the first column, quantity demand on the second column for X. We had a circumstance where it was 1 and we demanded 4 units, and we had a circumstance where the price was 2 and we demanded 2 units. And so that's going to be our fully filled in demand schedule. And let's take a look at what the previous tutor said, and they also said 1, 2, 4, 2. So good. I think we're all in agreement here. We're going to mark the solution as incorrect just because we disagreed about answer choice B, but overall, other than that, we were all in agreement there. Okay, now let's take a look at another question. The next question says, the exchange of factors of production for income occurs in the blank market. And so this is just a definition question. It's a factors market. That's where you exchange factors of production, and that's different from a labor market, or that's different from finished products market. And so the factor market is simply that market for inputs for production. Let's take a look at the previous tutor's answer. So they said, factor market in economics, the factor market may be defined as a market that facilitates the sale and purchase of services of factors. Factor inputs like land, labor, capital, etc. in return for factor incomes like rent, interest, or wages. Factors of production exchanged in the factor market is used by other manufacturing firms to produce goods and services for the final consumption of goods and services. For example, the labor market is a factor market. There's derived demand for the factor in the market since it is used as an input for the production of finished products. So what I meant when I said they're different is that the factor market is the overall umbrella of markets for factors of production, and a labor market is one of those subcategories. And these are all markets that are different from that market that you and I might be used to, like going to a store and buying something, and that's a market for finished products. And so this is a good answer. And we don't have anything else to add on to that, really. The next question says, the nature of demand indicates that as the price of a good increases, A, suppliers wish to sell less of it, B, more of it is produced, C, more of it is desired, and D, buyers desire to purchase less of it. So we're talking about the demand side, so anything that has to do with supply or production is not going to be the correct answer here, right? So A and B are not going to be right answers. A talks about suppliers, B talks about production, so we're going to eliminate those right off the bat. C says that as the price of a good increases, more of it is desired, and we know that this is the opposite of what the law of demand tells us. The law of demand tells us that when price goes up, quantity of demand goes down, and so when price goes up, we expect less of the good to be desired. And so answer choice D seems to be the only answer choice that works. Buyers desire to purchase less of it when the price of a good increases, and so we're going to go with D. Let's take a look at the previous tutor's answer. So the previous tutor said that in economics, demand is the total quantity that a consumer wishes to purchase at a particular price and at a particular point of time. On the graph, it is shown by the demand curve, which shows the relationship between the price and the quantity demanded. The law of demand states that if the price of a good increases, then the quantity demanded of that particular good decreases, keeping the other factor input constant. So it means that the price increases, then the buyer's desire to purchase less of it. Therefore, option D is the correct answer. So yeah, good answer, nothing wrong with that. Okay, this question says, if actual inflation exceeds anticipated inflation, who will lose purchasing power and who will gain? How does unanticipated inflation harm the employer harm the country? As part of your answer, include how you and your employer would both be affected. So we know that inflation is when the prices go up so that the purchasing power of the dollar goes down, right? And so we're asked to distinguish between actual and anticipated inflation, which is saying that when people don't have the ability to prepare for inflation, that's when we talk about when actual inflation exceeds anticipated inflation. So in that sense, who's losing purchasing power when this happens and who gains? So the people who are losing purchasing power, well technically, everybody's losing purchasing power, but the people who are, everybody in the economy, money is worth less. So the people who are benefiting from this loss of purchasing power are people who hold a lot of debt, right? Because all of a sudden with inflation, the nominal amount of debt has not changed, but the amount of purchasing power that debt buys has gone down. And so if you owe money and there's high inflation, more than anticipated inflation, then you benefit because you have less value to pay back on your debt. Those are the people who benefit. The people who are hurt are the people who lent out money, right? Who let other people use their money, because now the money that they're getting back, even though it's nominally what their principal was plus interest, the actual purchasing power of the money that they got back is actually lower. And so that's one of the big distinctions between who's benefiting and who's not. How does unanticipated inflation harm the country? And so most of the time when you have unanticipated inflation, the people are going to spend less time on productive activities and more time trying to work on activities that would isolate you from the effects of inflation. And one thing that could happen is for people who are
or lending out money, there's going to be less incentive for them to lend out money. That can decrease the amount of money available for loans. And also, you could also see that for people who are trying to make an investment in long-term projects, that those investments might not pay as much dividends when the purchasing power is lower in the future. And so you might see more short-term projects instead of long-term projects. And finally, the question asks us to talk about how your employer and how employees and employers would be affected. And so if we have high inflation, that means that the wages that employees are earning have effectively gone down. The real wage rate has gone down because even though you make the same amount of money, the prices have gone up and you can purchase less stuff. And so employees are going to be hurt by this policy. Meanwhile, employers will be benefited because they only have to pay out the same nominal wages while they're able to reap in larger nominal profits due to higher prices. And so they're benefiting from this high price situation and maintaining the same a lower real wage rate for paying their employees. So that's how employers and employees are being affected. So let's take a look at what the previous tutor said. So the previous tutor said that unexpected inflation is considerably more problematic. When inflation is higher than expected, it tends to hurt workers, recipients of fixed incomes, and savers. In contrast, unexpected inflation often benefits companies who can raise prices quickly without needing to raise wages in tandem, and borrowers who can repay their debt with money that is now worth less than when they borrowed it. Right, so this is what we were talking about. Over the long term, unanticipated inflation can cause a number of problems for an economy. Businesses will invest less in long-term projects because of the uncertainty of returns. Price information becomes distorted, and consumers will spend more time trying to protect themselves from inflation and less time engaging in productive activities. Periods of inflation also tend to redirect investment from businesses and towards hard assets, thus depriving companies of the capital that they need to grow and expand. Higher than anticipated inflation lowers the real wage rate, and employers gain at the expense of workers. Lower than anticipated inflation raises the real wage rate, and workers gain at the expense of employers. Higher than anticipated inflation lowers the real wage rate, increases the quantity of labor demanded, makes jobs easier to find, and lowers the unemployment rate. Sure. And lower than unanticipated inflation raises the real wage rate, decreases the quantity of labor demanded, and increases the unemployment rate. Right, so I think this tutor covers all the bases very well, and so nothing else much to add here. Great answer. And we can move on to the next question. Next question says, why are utilities, such as electricity and water, examples of natural monopolies? A says that the cost of production restricts competition in the market. B says that there are limited natural resources to meet demand. C says that consumers only trust known companies to provide these essentials. And D says there's no need for alternative options. So natural monopolies are one of those examples where an industry is predisposed to having a monopoly. And so for utilities, it happens a lot because there's a high cost of production for their industry. If you're an electric company, you have to set up the electric grid, the power lines. If you're a water company, you have to have all the piping and water tanks. And so there's a lot of costs that go into paying for the upfront infrastructure for these natural monopolies. And so A seems to be the best answer here. It's not that there are limited resources or that consumers only want a few companies. It's more so that the structure of the industry is such that it's almost impossible for a firm to enter this market and compete with these already established infrastructure firms. So A is going to be the best answer here. Let's take a look at the previous tier's answer. So the previous tier said, the cost of production restricts competition in the market when a firm exhibits economies of scale so large that per unit costs or average costs continue to decline with output. It may be efficient to have only one firm in an industry. When one firm with a low cost of production supplies the entire output, natural monopoly is said to exist. Natural monopoly is a firm in which the minimum efficient scale is large enough that one firm is enough to meet the entire demand of all consumers present in the market. These firms have economies of scale as compared to other firms that grant them the tag of natural monopoly and restricts the new entrants from entering into the industry. For example, electricity providers and water providers. So I think that's well said. Nothing much to add there. So we'll say great solution, great answer, and we'll mark that as correct. So next question says, how does lobbying benefit the government? 1 says, lobbying simplifies the decision-making process for lawmakers. 2 says, lobbying presents all interests equally. 3 says, lobbying helps educate and inform lawmakers. And 4 says, lobbying ensures all citizens' opinions inform government decisions. Not really an economics question, more of like a government question, but in terms of civics or government, lobbying primarily benefits the groups that are lobbying, right? Because you get government policy which favors the industry that you represent, or the party or union or collective that you represent. But there are some benefits that lobbying provides to governments, and that primarily is through education and information. Lobbyists are going to bring in a lot of studies, they're going to bring in a lot of information, a lot of testimony, and experts to kind of make their point. And without lobbying, it's unlikely that lawmakers would see as much of those pieces of information. And so lobbying is going to be important to help educate and inform lawmakers about certain issues. The only problem is that normally in today's society, we see that the groups that have the money to lobby extensively are groups that are normally very powerful and very well established in corporate, and that could be an issue for the policy making that you see by lawmakers. But 3 seems to be the best answer here. Lobbying helps benefit the government by helping to educate and inform lawmakers. Let's take a look at the previous tutor's answer. Previous tutor said 3 as well, and they said that lobbying refers to the acts of attempting to influence state or bureaucratic function and or the actions, decisions, and processes of lawmakers, legislators, as well as implementing officials to persuade them to act in favor of a personal benefit or objective. It's done by private individuals, organizations, professional lobbyists, interest groups, unions, cooperatives, government officials, advocacy groups, legislators, and or companies. The ethical aspects of lobbying are complex, considering how lobbying often creates a conflict of interest when officials who are supposed to act for the greater good and serve the public end up benefiting a small group of lobbyists or lobbyist clients with their actions. At the same time, persuasive strategies help educate and inform lawmakers. The initial definition, I just want to be clear, it's not like they're bribing anybody, right? They're just offering information and trying to build personal relationships and present their sides of on certain issues that would favor their clients, right? So that's going to be the major function that lobbyists are trying to serve. But yes, this is correct. And so it would mark that as correct. Next question says, government collects taxes to ensure that 1, citizens contribute to meeting society's needs. 2, there's sufficient money to fund private businesses. 3, politicians get paid in a timely manner. And 4, a government program exists for every need that arises. So again, not really sure if this is economics, maybe more so government or civics, but I'd say 1 is the best answer here, that citizens contribute to meeting society's needs. It's not going to be the case that you're trying to fund private businesses. Government doesn't collect taxes to fund private businesses. Government uses it to fund public programs and other forms of government spending. It's not the case that government's collecting taxes to ensure that politicians get paid. Yes, some money gets paid to politicians, but most of the money does not. And finally, government does not collect taxes to make sure that every single government program that exists for every single need is going to be covered. There's going to be a cost-benefit calculation involved in deciding whether or not a government program is necessary based on how much money it would cost. And so you don't just collect money so you could throw money at the wall and everything. So 1 is going to be the best answer. I want to clarify that from an economics standpoint, government typically is going to collect taxes from me in order to correct market failure in which you think that the cost curve for certain firms does not reflect the actual cost that they're imposing. So that may be externalities, it might be, something like that. And so that's something else that government might use taxes to do from an economic standpoint. Let's take a look at the previous tutor's answer. So they also chose 1, and they said that the provision of goods and services that cater to the collective needs of society, adding to their welfare, is not profitable enough of a market action to be undertaken by the private sector. Since public goods suffer from the problem of free riding due to their non-excludability, private producers and suppliers do not manufacture the same, hence it becomes the responsibility of the state to provide public goods to the population of the country. Tax receipts are the primary source of funds with which the government ensures the provision of public goods. They allow citizens to contribute to meeting society's needs that ultimately enhances their well-being. So yeah, again, that's a good point. Government needs to have money in order to provide public goods, since private companies will not do that, and so taxes are one way to get that money. So great, good answer. So let's take another look at this question, and it says, what part does interest play in deficit spending? A says government must pay interest on money they borrow when they take on debt. B says that citizens must pay interest when their government borrows money. C says governments may charge foreign countries interest when they borrow money. And D says interest is not a factor when a government's budget is in deficit. And so let's define some of the terms here. Interest is money that you accrue on debt, right? And so if you think of personal interest, when we take out a loan, we have to pay back the principal, and we also have to pay back interest, which is a percentage of overall money that we borrowed. Deficit spending is different than debt. Deficit spending refers to how much more do you spend in a year than you make in tax revenue. And so it's annual, it's not total. So the debt for the United States is probably like $17 trillion right now. Deficit spending is simply how much more money did we spend this year than we made in taxes, which is much smaller, probably like, I don't know, like close to like $1 trillion maybe. That's going to be the big difference. And so when we ask what part interest plays in deficit spending, the fact is that every single year, we rarely pay off the principal on our debt. We almost always are simply borrowing more money and then paying off the interest on our existing debt. And so that is going to be a contributing factor towards deficit spending every year. And that takes up not an insignificant amount of money. I think it's like 10% of the federal budget every year. And so don't quote me on that. That might not be entirely correct. So I'd have to look it up. So let's take a look at the answer choices. So A says governments must pay interest on money they borrow when they take on debt. And this is true. And so that seems to describe what we just talked about. B talks about citizens paying interest. And so we don't pay the interest. Well, I guess we pay interest indirectly, but most of it's government paying interest. C says that governments may charge foreign countries interest when they borrow money, and this is true, but again, we don't expect, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about deficit spending. That's when we're borrowing money, not loaning out money. And D says interest is not a factor. It definitely is a factor, so A is going to be the correct answer here. Let's take a look at the previous tutor's answer. So they said that in economics, the government's budget is a statement of both the revenue and expenditure of the government. The budget is said to be in deficit if the spending is more than the revenue or tax collected from the public. In case revenue or tax is greater than the spending, then we call the budget surplus. The amount by which government spending is greater than the revenue is also known as deficit spending. To cover that spending, they need to take out the loan, and so interest on that is paid by the government. So we want to clarify that interest is usually paid annually, so a non-insignificant portion of our annual budget goes to pay off the interest accrued on the national debt. Okay, the solution is correct, and we can move on to next. And so it looks like we've run out of questions for today. Hopefully that was helpful for you guys. And hope everybody's staying healthy and safe these days. Wishing you guys all the best, and I'll see you guys again next week for a few more lessons about micro and macro. Have a good one, guys.